this section, we've done our cleanup. We're going to get into playing with color and tone and light. And this is where a photograph really comes to life. And this is the fun part. This is where you get to play around and develop your own style, convey a mood through your picture, and really get to explore the ways that you can tell stories using color. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our cleanup layer. So you can right click and duplicate layer. And we're going to call this one color. Okay, I'm going to call this one color. I'll turn off the cleanup layer, I'll lock it and turn it off. So on this layer here, you'll see it's been cleaned up because we've duplicated this layer. We're going to convert this to a smart object. Right click, convert to smart object. That's the first step. That means that we can turn off what we do if we decide we don't like it. So because this is a raw photograph, we're going to have a lot of latitude to play with light, color and shade, even though the fact that this photograph is very well exposed to start with. The sky is blown out, and that's okay because the focus here is on Miss Price. So I'm going to go up to filter and camera raw filter. Now this is going to open up that box that we saw before, and this is where we get to have a play with all the different settings that are in here. This is basically like Lightroom but in Photoshop. So anything you can do in Lightroom, well, most things you can do in Photoshop, which is why I like to use it here because you can do so much more. So I'm going to step through really what this does first quickly, all of these sliders, and then I'm going to show you the way I like to approach editing. So we have firstly white balance, which is as the photograph is shot. If it's not right, we can play with these sliders. Temperature, that warms the image. You can already see just by doing that, it gives the photograph a completely different look. Or cool, okay, even just a little bit of coolness there can change. I like warm images, that's just myself, but I'm going to leave everything at the default to start off with. So tint, okay, light, okay, we've got like a magenta, or green. Green is like really retro, is one of those old school cameras have a lot of green tint in them. We're going to put that back to 0. Now exposure is how much light is in our picture. Now if I drag it up to the side, it makes it brighter. You'll see this histogram up here as well, shows us how all of our colors are split. Now you'll see if I click on this one, it's going to show that's all the part, there's no information there. That part's always going to be white. Even if I bring that exposure all the way down, there's still only going to be some white there. So exposure. Now contrast is the difference between brights and darks. Okay, that's really quite flat. That's really contrasty. Highlights, we're talking about the bright parts of the image. We make the bright parts brighter or less bright. Shadows. Do you want to make the shadows lighter or darker? And you'll see that all of these sliders, now heights and shadows, whites and blacks are a little bit similar but not quite. Whites in general will brighten the whole image. Now because I'm screen recording, my computer's slowing down a little bit. Darken the whole image. Blacks will do the same. Okay, they'll bring the darks or lighten them. Put all these back to 0. Whoops. And now texture, clarity and dehaze. Now texture, I never use this. I know some people like it, but it makes everything look really gritty, which I don't like. Or if you take it all the way to the left, it gets really cartoony. So I never really touch that. Clarity sometimes. Okay, sometimes it makes it look awful. Okay, other times it can work, but I don't usually touch those. Now dehaze, sometimes you can use, it takes out that shine. So you'll see here I've got a really quite shallow depth of field, so you'll see my light is bouncing off these flowers, which is exactly what I wanted. But if I wanted to reduce that, I can dehaze it, or I can add in that haze. But these three I don't usually do too much with. Now vibrance is how bright your colors are. Okay, are they really muted or are they really vibrant? And saturation is how much color there is. So if you want to do black and white photograph, that's when you take the saturation right down to nothing. Obviously, you know, if you want a bright poppy color, you can bring the saturation up. So these are all of the basic controls, and this is called the basic tab by clicking on this one here. And you'll see that none of these are right or wrong. You can really overdo things, but sometimes when you play and you get the right combinations, that's when you start to get those creative effects. Now the next is the tone curve. There are so many mastering the tone curve tutorials that you can go and watch. I like it to be point, not this one, but point. And basically you can choose your midtones, highlights, and shadows. So highlights are up here. I want them to be brighter. Okay. Some really weird things can happen if you do too much with the point curve, but sometimes if you just, subtle, simple adjustments, quite often the presets will always start with an S curve, which is where they add a bit of contrast. So I'm not going to play with the point curve. I'm going to leave that back to, if I go back to linear, puts it back to normal. I'm going to leave that flat. Sharpening. If I want to sharpen the image, sometimes sharpening just a little bit is nice. It makes everything nice and clear, and not too much because it gets really quite weird looking. I'm going to leave that. Now, noise reduction in luminance is how you can get rid of some grain. Now, this is a really good camera, and there isn't that much grain. And you'll see everything goes a bit smooth and a bit weird. So that's not something I usually play with too much. Sometimes I'll sharpen just a little bit, but really I leave most of that alone. Now HSL adjustments we will get to in a minute. I'm going to go back and fit this down here. Okay, now let's say I want to change this green. So hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue is the type of green. All of these colors are split. So I'll use the green in the leaves as a great example. I can change this, bring it to the left to make the greens more yellow. Now, when you're talking about color theory, sometimes there are colors that work really well together. This is how you can match those tones. Maybe I want them to be more green towards the blue slider. I really quite like more yellow greens. That's my preference and my style, but I'm going to leave it in the middle again. Reds and oranges you have to be careful with because there are skin tones. So if you play with reds and oranges too much, sometimes you'll end up with really skin that doesn't look natural, and you always want to try to keep the skin as close to possible as natural. Saturation, same deal. Maybe I really wanted to bring that red down. Okay, maybe I think there's too much. I want it to be a little, little less red. Maybe I want to make the greens, more green, okay, or less green. I actually really like that. I quite like a desaturated green. It suits what I like to do. And we'll go into, again, I'll just default all these, go back into luminance. Now luminance is just like shininess and brightness. So let's look at the pink. I think they'll be under magentas. Okay, again, see, since skin tones are often affected, and you have to be careful. So HSL sliders can be really powerful. Now split toning. Split toning is basically like color grading. We can put a color in the shadows and we can put a color in the highlights. So let's look at our shadows. Our shadows are all of these dark areas. Now let's say I wanted to I'll do the classic Hollywood teal and orange. I could move my shadows to this teal section here and bring up the saturation, and you'll see that just in the shadows it gives it that teal look. Now if I do the highlights, it's all the bright parts. So let's say I put that into the orange. Okay, maybe a bit more orange. And it's just in the highlights. Now teal and orange is a really, really popular. I would play a lot more around with this to get it right, but it's one of those quite popular color grading styles. But I will reset everything back to 0. Okay, we don't worry about this one. And now effects, grain. Do we want to add grain? I don't want to add grain, but some people like it. Adding a bit of grain can give it a bit of a vintage feel. If that's what you're going for, you can add some grain. Obviously you can play around with the amount, not too much. Never overdo anything if you can. Now vignetting is adding in either that white or that black around the edge. Now this can actually be, if you do it too much, it looks ridiculous, okay? But just a little vignette can sometimes draw your eye into the frame, and it can be quite a nice thing. Now once you've made that, let's say I wanted it to feather more so it wasn't so harsh, I could feather it out, or I could make it a complete circle like that. You can see there's no feathering at all. I could make it rounder, change the midpoint. There's a lot that you could do with a vignette, but I will just go back to no vignette. Calibration, do not worry, we're not going to use that. And then presets. Now presets we're going to talk about in the next video, but these are all of the basic tools, the basic color tools in Adobe Camera Raw, and the fun part is playing around with them and getting combinations that you like to create the mood that you like. So I'm going to save this video and then we'll look at presets in the next one.